How long should I be talking for?
About 20 minutes.
Yeah,
Okay, so welcome to the Food History Seminar. We've got two speakers for tonight, who are Christian Reynolds from Sheffield and Gurpinder Lalli, thank you, from Wolverhampton. I meant to ask you that before. So the two topics are using historic dietary surveys to examine the UK's changing diet and food habits from 1800s to 2019. And Gurpinder is talking about the English school meal. So we'll start off with Christian, and off you go.
Okay, hi and good evening everyone. Thanks for coming this evening. I think two really fascinating talks, and I'll try and put a bit of English school meal into mine if at all possible. So this is a collection of ideas that have been bubbling around my head for the last 3 or 4 years since I moved to the UK, and I just tried to use this as an opportunity to get them down on paper, to highlight these and to actually drive me towards actually thinking about them in a coherent manner. So my apologies about the rantings for the next 10 to 20 minutes or so. Firstly, good evening. My name is Christian Reynolds. I have a very mixed methods background. I started off in Australia at the University of South Australia and did my PhD in food waste there. Moved up to Scotland for my first postdoc and went to the Reynolds Research Institute, which is where I started getting exposed to what I'll be talking about tonight, which is historic dietary surveys. And I was one of the last people to be living on the Reynolds campus when the library was there, which had all these historic dietary surveys in the physical book, and so I was actually able to start flipping through and living and breathing the lovely smell that you can smell around you, a very similar smell to that. But I moved on since then into doing more kind of economic or environmental modelling and looking at food waste and the environmental impacts of diet. And so I'll try and close the loop at the end of this discussion and actually think through how my own research could start being informed by these sorts of things and how we could think more about this. But in a way, I'm just kind of highlighting and thinking these are resources over this time period that I'm going to be going into and talking about today. And I think a lot of people are not aware of their existence or that they could be useful for many different things. And so this has been a long journey over the last 5 years of thinking about this. And I'm just going to put up firstly some different books that have been starting to influence me or starting to get me to think about that. So we first have Englishman's Food by Jack Drummond, which is a really interesting book about 15th century onwards food and English food culture, edible food. Then this I discovered in the Route, which was a copy of John Boyd Orr, who was one of the founders of the Route, or the founder of the Route, Food, Health and Income, which was an amazing book looking at different social demography of food and how food consumption can shape many different things. Pure, White and Deadly by John Yudkin came from this book over here, which was the making of the modern British diet, which was an edited collection, which also led me to Derek Oddie's work. So two other books which led from the top three. But these are all about the shaping and changing of the UK diet over the last 100, 200 years and different perspectives on this. And these were gateway drugs, if you will. There were many others, but I just thought putting out some of the different titles which got me thinking through this long view perspective and then trying to go back to the primary sources these people were using to actually see if I could reinterpret them with fresh eyes, having another 50 years, having another, some cases, 100 years of perspective. What do we now look at those and see? And so I was going through discussions of the thing I'm going to be talking about this evening, which is dietary surveys. And in the mid-90s, there was a Nutrition Society conference, which was talking about dietary surveys and methods. And there was a brilliant passage at the front, which was, I'll read out, sorry about that, but in case it's not visible for YouTube. Nowadays, in order to get information on food consumption and nutrition intake in different groups, we do not have to examine the grapevines and garbage pits. Instead, we conduct dietary surveys using nutritionists, dietitians, nurses, physicians, computer systems analysts, technicians and assistants, etc., etc. So a different way of looking at it. And the paragraph before this was saying in previous food history we had to rely on artifact, we had to rely on best guesstimate, we had to look at how people use food in finds and things like that. And I think I would like to turn that on its head in a way. In 50 years or 100 years past since when dietary assessments first came in, we're now having to actually do archaeology into the dietary surveys themselves and looking at them with fresh eyes and reinterpretations of those compared to the grave findings and garbage pits as a new form of things that we as historians or analysts or whatever you like could actually start thinking about and using actively as a different source of primary material. So dietary food surveys are surveys, as they say, which ask people either expenditure, so how much you pay for things, asking what you purchase of things over a weekly period or a daily period, or what you consume of things. There's three distinct bands, but they all fall into this categorization of surveys asking people about their habits. And of course, people can lie, people can misreport. There's lots of fundamental problems with them. However, they have been going on for quite a while. So we were talking back to the long 18th century. So the earliest in the UK go back to around just the turn of the 1800s, into 1797 and 1795, and it was looking at agricultural labourers' diets and the purchases involved. So not necessarily the quantities, but how much things were spent and what was bought from these. You can then go through some other of the different ones, but over the 1800s there was probably around 300 to 400 households there of different dietary conditions that were coming up within agriculture and within urban communities over that time. So you can actually start exploring in the different dietary surveys that are existing, differences in inequality, differences in tastes in food, and also if you then take it to another extreme and put nutritional interfaces with that, you can start looking at calories, when you don't have enough food, malnutrition, balances, and those sorts of things within working class, urban, rural, those sorts of things, which is what Ian Gasley and some other people have started doing over the last decade or so. Really fascinating things in terms of that, but nobody's really gone into ingredient listings so far. So I know a lot of us probably have been looking through different foods, and this is from Jack Drummond's Englishman's Foods, one of the appendices, and trying to give ideas and typical British diets from throughout the last 500 years in one of the appendices. So you can see back in the 15th century a peasant, so milk, whey, cheese, bacon, muslin, etc., through to different 1800s style diets. And this was from Jack Drummond's work in the Englishman's Food. And just thinking through, and you can track through these different surveys and through these different books how people's diets changed in that time, which I find quite fascinating. And you could then lock on top of that the nutritional estimations, you could lock on top of it food security and a lot of other discussions around that and use that as a launch point in. But what I think really starts to get interesting is when you start thinking there's more than 300 later on. And that's where the surveys post-1900 or coming up to 1900 start to get very interesting. You start to get almost a representative sample of surveys or wider than that at these later points in time. And so thinking through, the US Commissioner of Labour had a very big multi-country survey, so over 6,000 households in the US, but then in the UK there was about 1,000 back in the 1880s to 1890s, and these were working class in a series of occupations to look at how people in these specific occupations compared around the world in terms of what they ate, how they lived, the quality of life, etc. Which, again, looking at those differences on a global scale, but you can go back to those existing collections and look at each household individually, which is what I'll come to in a second. You then have the 1904 Board of Trade, so on and so forth down here. A couple of the really interesting ones for me is the Ministry of Labour, this one here, the 37 and the 53. So these were purchase surveys where they not only recorded what they had in kind of a category form, but they had free text boxes next to it, which meant you could write down a lot more information, though it was never really integrated into the survey. But it means if you had specific brands of food or those sorts of things, to my knowledge, these have never really been dived into in that depth before, but you could start going back and looking at branding within a quite sizable amount of households there and interactions within that. And this was across all segments and geographies. These were taken across the different regions. So you can get a very wide-ranging, if you instead of going to the specific documents, which were these, which were summary documents produced in amazing works of their time, instead going back and actually looking at the originals which are in the British Archive, or some of them are digitised. So and all handwritten still and amazingly accessible. And so this, just for reference's sake, is a sheet from the 1951 National Food Survey and how you would account for it. So when you went, occupation, etc. A 5 or 6 page survey everybody would have to fill out who participated. So a lot of that labour there, but things you can start actually to unpack and think about. So the one that has continued of this is this one here, the 1942 National Food Survey. So that, every year since 1942, has had around about 9,000 households, give or take with sampling, completing it every year. And that has evolved over time to become the Living Costs and Food Survey. And this, to me, is a quite fascinating survey because it has evolved in part with time, and there's a little bit of a riddle or a mystery with this with here. And this on this axis is the kilocalories, and this is a purchase survey talking about asking people, what did you buy, what did you eat inside the home? And throughout this time, 1940 to 2000, it was rebased here, and they asked and they found calories were dropping off, but they were also finding obesity was increasing. There was different public health issues. So why in the National Purchase Survey was this drop off from about the 60s onwards? And the reason, of course, was they were only asking about food purchased for consumption inside the home. And you can see a story here even emerging of this block here being that people were starting to eat outside the home in those times. And so how do you actually start balancing that and starting to think of the narrative there? And so the Living Cost and Food Survey, when it was introduced, brought in that additional questions around how do people eat outside the home as well as inside the home. And linking back to school meals, within this survey with the children, if they're being recorded, there is records within all of these surveys of what the children were having at school lunches and for free school milk. So there were specific categories to look at within the children: how much milk did they drink, how much food did they get at school, etc. So it might not be specific quantity, exactly what the menu was, but you would have how much of that. And I find these are quite fascinating things to then look at a geographic level. And to me, these stories tell the tale of the changing diet. So if you can see some different categories there in terms of total meat per week, milk and cream consumption flatlined, fruit increases as different quantities and types of fruit start emerging into the UK diet. Eggs suddenly decreases sharply from about the 70s onwards, representing possibly the health scares and the differences in nutritional information. And I think some of the fascinating things is soya and soya proteins start getting recorded in the 1970s and continues to go up and up and up. And you can start going in tracking individual foods or categories of food in here as a sense check almost for other investigations into this. And does the animated GIF work on this? Yes, it does. Okay. So this is from 74 to 2014, which is the data set of the Living Costs and Food Survey that's been digitised and put online to be openly accessible. And you can see a very transformative diet here. So you can see back here that the potatoes were heavily eaten through to being a lot less, but in contrast, the cereals has come to fill in that gap. And that can be showing the multiculturalism of the UK diet. So you're having pasta, you're having rice, couscous, all those other cereal-based products are entering rather than it being bread or potatoes. You can also see that soft drinks start actually being recorded by 2014. Well, back in the 1970s they weren't recorded, actually they were, but they were then excluded from the actual data set. So there are different things that happen and different choices the councils make over that time. You can see there is a lot of different information here that can be withdrawn. And I think you could take this at the macro level, but what for me is really rich and interesting is taking it down to individual household questions and actually sense checking and giving evidence to historic trends. So let's look at some historic households within this. This was a household, 4-person. The husband and wife were early 50s to mid 50s. And these were the foods they ate over the 7 days. These were the foods they purchased into broad categories. So there's butter from New Zealand, if we're talking import and export. They have canned soup, looking at technology. They have canned meat, lots of other stories that could be drawn out from this in terms of this. And with this, there's also the amounts paid, the amount of purchased as well. So you've got weights, measures, etc. But let's look at a different story in terms of a vegetarian household from that time, which again, household of 4, early 50s. And you can see a lot more fresh fruits and vegetables in there and a very different lifestyle happening here. because of the ethics and things like that, we can know a bit of the geography, but we don't exactly know who these people are. But we can start thinking around the lives of these people and reflecting, would these be the same diets they would be having as these early 50s today? And then thinking through to my own research, which is in terms of the environmental impact of food, you can start thinking, how do people's historic diets compare to today's diets, and how do a life course of diet intervene? So 2 separate questions here on this slide. Firstly, in terms of the environmental impact of either the husband or wife, the household environmental impact per age of husband and wife. So looking at how having an age of a household actually might change the environmental impact based on what they're consuming, the size of the household, those different sorts of things. You could actually start thinking around, in the 1970s, a graph like this. So until the mid-30s it's quite low, but then with children and income increases, different things start happening. Likewise, you could split out vegetarians, pescatarians, meat eaters, and omnivores, and actually look at the difference in environmental impact between those sorts of things in a dietary survey. And you could not only apply that to 1 year, but you could do that for the whole dietary process, which is what I started to think of doing, and that's where I've kind of come into this, as it were, which is just looking at the year of birth and the amount of kilocalories per day. And so you can see from this one, and this is with greenhouse gas, but it's similar for kilocalories, there's a slope which happens along a person's life course. So when you're younger, you purchase less or consume less calories and up to a point, and then there's a tipping point as you get older, you eat less and you reduce down. And you can see here, if you're thinking about this, happens over a lot of different birth decades. There's a good trajectory there. But when you also combine that with a shifting diet, and this is where I got very excited, you can actually start thinking about how sustainable our diet has been over the time periods. And that's what really got me excited, because you can see here, if this was a BuzzFeed news thing, saying that the people born later on, so the millennials, the Gen Xs, etc., have typically lower environmental impact diets than people born earlier in the century. And that's because they're eating more fish, less ruminant meat, they're eating more fruits and vegetables, less of other things. And so there's different things happening at the birth level, averaged across, as well as within a person's life course. So some fascinating things that can be drawn out from actually looking through these dietary surveys with some different fresh eyes and thinking about the dietary patterns that existed 100 years ago and how those have changed, and the food culture that's changed around them for today. So, in summary, as I know we're kind of running rapidly out of time here, we now have over 200 years of different dietary survey evidence on food, expenditure, consumption, lots of different types. We can look at evidence of trends, fads, etc. from 1800s to present, with past 1940 in a lot of detail. But to me, and to my knowledge of food history, be it that I'm a newcomer to this area and I come from a different discipline, I've been trying to look through these past surveys, and I'm not sure that right now we're embracing or capitalising on the amount of really interesting information that's available within them or could be relevant to so many different topics. Many also have this free text information on brands or other things that could be exploited. So I'd love to just have a talk or any ideas about what could be done or how I could take this forward if you're interested in that. But thank you very much. Please contact me for further ideas. And if I can just do a slight shout out for today, the University of Sheffield launched a fundraising campaign today for the Desert Garden Appeal, which is a growing food in Zaatari, which is one of the big refugee centres in Jordan, and it's taking old mattresses and using hydroponic technology to enable people to actually farm inside a refugee camp, which is quite extraordinary. So we're doing kind of a just giving thing, so £10 provides plants and nutrient solution for one family, 25 grows enough for a lot of tomatoes, and 100 provides a full hydroponic garden for a family. So shameless promotion there in terms of if you Google Desert Garden Appeal, but it's just one of the things that's been on the BBC a little bit yesterday and today, and so we're shamelessly promoting it because the Research Council sadly say it's not research, even though there is research happening, but it just has a big difference, a really big difference to be made to a lot of human beings if you're interested or want to shout about it to other people. But thank you again, and I'll look forward to any questions.
I've got time for for a few questions before we move to the speakers. Any questions? Yeah.
And what about Booth, study poverty? You didn't mention that. And also Charles Booth. I mean, does he bring in food? I can't remember.
Charles Booth's
Big
work,
London.
he does. It's on the to-read list, if I'm being absolutely honest, because it's a big book.
Well, it's a row of big people.
Yeah. I went to look for them on 8 books and realised that they're not something I can afford easily. So I dipped into them at the University of Sheffield Library, but I've not read through them fully. So sorry about that.
So what about the other Booth? Sorry, the Roundtree.
The Roundtree Booth survey, yeah. So that is actually this.
No, you don't.
I didn't put it here.
No, it's poverty. 1901. You've listed a Roundtree.
Oh, bother. Okay.
And somebody else.
Yes.
I've forgotten the other one.
Sorry.
Which
Yeah.
is 1912, I think.
Yeah, you're right. Okay.
Because the poverty one's got a lot of material on food.
Okay. 1901.
I think it's 1901. Is it 1901, 1903?
1991.
It's
Yeah.
around there.
About
Yes.
the time of the World War, if I'm correct.
Okay.
Thank you.
And it's, what you don't say, sorry, may I?
Yeah.
It's perhaps worth thinking about if you're wanting to compare these, which at times I think you're implying you are, is you've really got to think a lot harder about how the data were collected. Because the National Food Survey, you know how the data are collected for that.
Well, in terms of the mail out and the fruit, is that what you're suggesting yet?
National Food Survey?
National Food Survey I know from 40 to 44
That's
it was
right.
sent out by post, they got a certain amount of attrition rate.
They had to keep a diary over a
7-day period,
That's
yes.
right.
Yeah.
But it's one person keeping the diary of
For the whole
purchases
household.
For the whole
Yeah.
household.
Yeah.
Which is very different from surveying people individually and asking what they eat.
Yes.
And I mean, because one of the things about the National Food Survey, which was always the criticism of it, is that it only tells you about the total household.
Yes.
It tells you nothing about how that food was distributed within the household. So you have to take those kinds of things into account, I think, in a bit more detail when considering about what use you can make of these. I mean, I entirely agree with you. They're a most wonderful resource, and I'm sure they're underused. And I think, I mean, you can go up to date even more. I don't know why you've left out MDNS.
Mainly because it's a consumption survey and these are all the purchase surveys.
Oh, okay.
So
because you didn't say that.
Yeah.
You talked about dietary surveys.
Yeah. I was a bit misleading. Yeah. So
Let me just say, NDNS is the National Diet and Nutrition Survey, which is currently run. I think it's back now with the Department of Health.
Cambridge are running it from this year.
No, it's
who
the
owns
government
it?
department who's responsible for it. I think it's back to the Department of Health. For a while, when the Food Standards Agency was set up, it went to the Food Standards Agency, but the coalition government took nutrition back from FSA to Department of Health in 2010, so I think it's back there.
Yes.
And there are some data on food purchase, not in a systematic fashion, but about food, which is a survey which is run by the Food Standards Agency. It's a time series, and it's been run every 2 years. It's just about to collect data for its 6th wave. So that must be
Food
12.
Union?
Pardon? Food Union.
Food
Yeah.
Union. Yes.
Stupid name. And that also is potentially quite useful because it's deliberately a time series. So although it's not longitudinal, so it's not the same people being asked questions every 2 years. It's nonetheless it's the same sets of questions as far as possible. I mean, we have had to break it. Sorry, I should declare an interest because I'm on the working group for it.
Okay.
But it does give you it's time trend data, and so that might be worth if you're trying to propose and urge people to use these.
Yeah.
Then I think that's a very good idea, very valuable. Then I think it could be a good idea to try and just organise them in a sort of table almost, their dates, who's responsible for them, how, and something about the methodology, and how the surveys, how the samples were recruited, because some of the very early ones could be quite ad hoc.
Yeah, I have sneaking suspicions some of the agricultural labourers were just who was able to find in the pub to buy the drink for, to say, what did you eat for them?
Okay, but as long as you know that,
yeah,
you can still make something of it.
Yeah, very much so. But no, thank you. I should have also mentioned the other ones. So, yeah, you're right.
Thank you for the interesting presentation. I was wondering, as far as I know, the 2 world wars were really important when we're talking about food and diets, but in general, wars have always been important in changing consumption patterns in general and food diet in particular. So I was wondering if you noticed, even in the period previous the 2 world wars, if you notice some important changes, or if this could be an interesting trend to analyze.
Yeah. So I would first. Definitely. So the National Food Survey 1940 was established, I think, with rationing slightly in mind in terms of looking at the nation's health, and you can probably correct me.
The politics of it was when rationing was introduced, there was a worry that the working class would suffer nutritionally. Ironically, actually, they did a lot better. But that they didn't know at the time. So I think the first 2 or 3, in fact, up down to 1952 or 3.
So rationing was till 1956? 4, sorry. But you can definitely see rationing and then post-rationing.
You have to be very careful, because originally it wasn't the whole population.
No, it was
only the working classes. That's right. Because it was specifically to make sure that they could have some kind of way of assessing whether or not rationing was affecting some groups in the population adversely and disproportionately. It turned out that it wasn't, but that's how it started. And then in 50, whatever it was, 50, I think it was before rationing finished, they then extended it. I think it might be 51. I should say that if you're wanting to use, because the National Food Survey data are in the Essex Archive, and in the 90s, Ben Fine and colleagues were reanalysing NFS data, and it was apparently, I mean, I didn't do it, I was involved in some ways, but it's purgatory to deal with those files.
Yeah.
So if you're cheerfully going after original data, you've got to ask in what form they are.
Yeah.
Oh, and you do know that George Davey Smith and, I've forgotten the other 2 blokes' names, but the epidemiologist George Davey Smith reanalysed Boydall's original data from Food, Health and Income.
No, I did not. I'll write down these names afterwards.
All right, I'll tell you later. Yeah. I mean, you do have to realise that things like Food, Health and Income, that's the 1932, the Aberdeen one. Yeah. That, along with Roundtree's poverty, they were deliberately highly politicised, because both of those were very committed to showing that the working class were doing extremely badly. And that, Food, Health and Income is the title for Boydall's little survey. It's no accident that he's got health and income in there with food, because he was showing that the working class were really, there was a classic class gradient.
Yeah.
The lower the social class, the worse the health, the poorer the diet.
So I guess in answer to that as well, so the what you were just saying about the Roundtree, so this Carnegie one, which was pre-war, and then the 1918 one, they also did upper class, a small sample of other classes besides working class. And so there is a very interesting, in the conference which I got this from, the Nutrition Society back in 96, there's a panel
Actually trying to compare the pre- and post-war diets of First World War and Second World War and the impact the war had on them. So it's in the Proceedings of the Nutrition Society, just looking at that sort of how the war may have affected the population. Again, with all the caveats of these dietary surveys are not perfect, but they do offer a thing of resources that I feel isn't tapped.
And previous wars, I mean,
Oh.
in the 19th century, it could be like, could see some difference, or there's not enough data.
This is
civilian population.
this is the thing. I would say the Boer War did not affect civilian population. The French War, well, the wars were before that, which affected the civilian population. And then you're thinking around, look at the technological developments that happened in the Napoleonic Wars, post-Napoleonic, in terms of canning and all those other things. So there was a lot of other stuff happening in corn law that is besides war. And then I'm totally outside my domain expertise in that, and people can correct me totally with that one.
Is there a way to... Sorry.
So I just wondered, I mean, you mentioned class, and I think obviously that is important, but I just wonder about regions.
Yes.
How significant are regional variations in diet?
Dramatic. The further back you go, these surveys are all regional, and you can see differences within them. And I think that's a really interesting part of this book and this book in terms of looking at the differences in regional calorie consumption at different points, even into 1950, 1930. The appendix in this has differences in regional calorie and other consumption intakes. No?
Yes, they have it. I've always wondered whether that's anything to do with geography or whether it is actually to do with the distribution of wealth, and that's geographically uneven.
Yeah.
In other words, geography is proxy for poverty.
Well, just thinking in terms of, sorry, I'm going over time, so it was just in terms of thinking of the historical Scottish or Welsh diets and what crops could be grown in that area,
Oh, sure.
as well as, so depending what measure of dietary quality we have. And yeah, but
Oats are good for you.
oats are good for you, barley's good, but yeah, different things, different cooking, etc. All really complex as any food history is.
I think we need to end the questions for this bit there, if that's okay, and we'll move to our second speaker. But there will be time to ask at the end for any further questions with both speakers. So can we just say thank you again, Christian? And I'm just going to end the live stream at that point.
English school meal?
Yeah, that's the one.